All right, Bill, we're recording now, so Lee, why don't you take it away?
Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Jack, for getting us set up for this, and welcome everyone. We're going to talk a bit about information security in general. It's obviously a very broad topic. It's hard to go through all the aspects of it in a short period of time. So what I'm going to try and do is give a flavor of some of the things that we'd like you to keep in top of mind when you're working on um, projects related to Blue Hack, but also as you do other work, whether it's within IBM or something you're doing for a partner or another organization down the road. So we'll talk a little bit about principles. We'll talk a little bit about some of the key aspects that we want you to keep an eye on. And if there's time, we'll go into some specific items that, what we have here in research. We have a set of development operations DevOps champions who have been really at the forefront of trying to work the transition of IBM research off of legacy technologies and services to new tools and processes for building agile apps and deploying them and maintaining them in the new model with these new tools. And so they have a whole set of content put together that you could also access. And I'm not sure there's time for that to go through in any detail for you guys as you work on the Blue Hack piece this week, but certainly something that's out there for later. And I did pull a few of their slides in to get to reference those if I have an opportunity. This is also part of we did a webinar for specifically for interns that were here in Yorktown, and it was also broadcast to a couple other sites. We talked about services for IT, we talked about a bit about DevOps, and we talked a bit about security. So if you've seen that, most of this may be a repeat for you. I apologize. But for others who hadn't had a chance to see that, you'll see some of it here, and there's more content available in that education recording, which is up on our research wiki for cybersecurity, and I have a reference link to that later in the deck. So let's jump in and get started with some of this. Let's hope that I'm clicking away the right things. Okay, so you're going to have access to systems and data. Some, of course, more valuable than others. I like cars, so I always trying to blend them in with presentations and discussions whenever I can. So you may find stuff that has little intrinsic value. At the moment, in the bottom left, the rusted buckets. Not to say it's got no value. Somebody might find a good use for that, or fix it up and find out it's something extremely valuable. To more moderate items, and what I'm talking about is not just the systems themselves and their ability, their capability for being attacked or exploited or used, maliciously or inadvertently by others unauthorized, but also the data and how sensitive that data is, right? Is it public domain? Is it something that's got a copyright? All the way up to, is it something that's regulated by the US government for export? Is it something related to the military? Or is it highly sensitive data about a person, their social security numbers, some of their sensitive personal information? And as far as, certainly trust being a big part of this, right? We want to be able to always talk about significantly in IBM about trust in the individual, and also we want customers to trust us. We want them to trust us with their business, their services we provide. We want them to be able to trust that we're going to take good care of their data. So when we talk about this talk, as I said in the past, had been geared a couple months ago to interns specifically. That's why you see this. It isn't limited to interns by any means. We want everybody to be inside that circle of trust. And if you don't recognize this, it's from a movie series, Meet the Fockers, and the main characters talk about this circle of trust and being inside there. We certainly want everyone to be inside the trusted bubble of doing all the best practices and the right things that are keeping IBM and our customers and the data, whether it's IBM or others, that we're dealing with it appropriately, that we're giving it the right respect, we're protecting it the right way, And so that is something that we really need to be doing and thinking about all throughout our steps of our work, not just at one particular point. And I'll get into that a little bit. So the key, the mantra, if you will, the key items that we want you to think about in your daily work, are these five. So you have, identify, what is it that I'm working with? What's the system that I'm building, or what's the system that I'm using? What am I developing? What will it do? What kind of data am I going to have? What kind of respect, if you will, do I need for that data? And we chose the word respect specifically because it isn't just about can you legally do something with data. It's also about should you do something with data. We know there are incidents in the press, of course, where people have been able to take data from different sources and tie them together in some way and run some analytics and find out some very interesting things that from a personal perspective for an individual can cross the line. And so yes, it's respecting the sensitivity of the data, but also in some degree the ethics of what we're doing. IBM wants to, of course, act in the most ethical way, even independent of any specific regulation. And we can help guide you if there's any questions. A lot of times you will not run into this. More often than not, you're in the realm of here's a contract, here's a government regulation on healthcare data, and there's certain regulations that you just need to follow, and so the respect would follow respect for those policies and those guidelines and practices and those laws. Protect, of course, once we know what we have and what it's supposed to do, and we respect the gravity of that and the sensitivity. We want to protect it in the right way. There's always a balance between the cost of, security and the value benefit. So you can't spend millions of dollars on security for something that is only worth, $100,000. So, but you want to provide the right level of protection that is compliant and manages the risk to that system, that service, that piece of data. And then you move on to detect and react, right? Because you want to know if something's going wrong with that environment. Is an app that I just put up, is it starting to see anomalous behavior? Is it starting to act in a way that I did not expect? Is somebody being able to strip or pull data from it that they shouldn't have? So you want to have some way of knowing whether something's going wrong. And then the last piece, of course, is if you do find that something is going wrong, we need to react to it. The reaction could be as simple as, where something is utilizing, some cases maybe, right, real world cases, of course, right, where an app has been exploited because of a vulnerability, and now it's been turned into something that is reflecting malicious traffic and being used to attack others. That might be as simple as just, creating a report, an incident report, and then just shutting it down and redeploying it with the appropriate vulnerability closed out. Sometimes you get into more significant investigations, right? If it's a customer's data and it was confidential data and was not to be released to the public and there was an exposure, that could result in some more investigation and detail. But those cases are certainly less common within IBM. And when you talk about this type of hackathon, the Blue Hack, it's unlikely that you'd get involved in anything to that nature and sensitive data. As I understand, you won't, but I do want to make sure people are aware of that. So you do want to be in a position to react if something is not working properly and see, is it something that could be a security situation. Okay, usually I would build this slide. When I did this talk to the interns a couple months ago, there was a room full of about 50 or so people in the room, and then others in remote locations. I asked, question up front, show of hands, anybody working on information security as part of their work this summer for the internship, and no one raised their hand. And of course, the big stinger once I got to the next slide and the build is really everyone is responsible for security, even if that's not core part of what you're doing in building a security solution, which is, I think, what they took the question to mean, and I'm sure that's natural to do that. We really need people to be thinking about privacy and security from the very beginning, all throughout development and then into operations, because building it in afterwards is very difficult, and much harder, much more costly. And if you're thinking about it early on, what levels of privacy and personal information, what levels of data security, what type of system security do I need? Where can I deploy this? If you're doing that all up front, and then you're also building that in as you develop your applications, looking for vulnerabilities that are common in web applications, SQL injections and cross-site scripting and request forgeries. Fixing those common vulnerabilities, those are the ones that it's easy to find on the internet, especially when you're exposing things externally. So we want you to be thinking about it and addressing these things all throughout the life cycle of the projects that you work on. Okay, and we've covered quite a bit of this already, right? What is the nature of what I'm doing? But then who should have access to it? Who can I share this with, right? How do I provide, what credential stores do I use, right? Internally, many people utilize the IBM Blue Pages directory and what's called the W3 ID. That's a nice mechanism, right? You don't have to worry about building your own user ID database and credential store and managing credentials for people. You get to leverage calls to an existing environment that's got all IBMers and contractors that are part of IBM internal. And then when they're no longer, if someone leaves the company and they no longer have a way to log into your application, and if your app is suitable for anyone in IBM to access, then that's a really good mechanism to use, and helps actually reduce some of the burden on you for some of the security and compliance pieces. You do want to make sure that when you're making those calls and you're accepting the password that the person is presenting for single sign-on and for verification, that you're not accepting that over a clear channel over the network so that it could be viewed by others. So you want to use something like, of course, if you're HTTP, web services, you want to use HTTPS in order to make sure that that session is encrypted. If you are dealing with something, and I don't think this will be the case in BlueHack, but if you end up in other projects dealing with something that has limited access, right? How do you do that? How do you revalidate? How do you guarantee? Is it part of a Blue group that's part of the W3 Blue Pages ID, or are you creating your own groups, and how are those maintained, managed, and revalidated? So those are other things that you want to think about as you're putting together applications and providing access to data or storing data. Because, of course, bad things can happen, and they do happen quite often, unfortunately, both inside and outside of IBM. I'm sure almost everyone has heard, major horror stories in the press about, organizations that have been breached many times by leveraging an insider. Maybe it's a phishing attack, maybe it's an unsecure network that a separate contract organization uses that had nothing to do with the data center or the sensitive piece of database that used for their customers, but that was what that little chink in the armor, that loose, weakest link, was then used to get into very sensitive areas and siphon off, tens of millions, in some cases, right, tens of millions of records for customers, and then that data goes out onto the black market and the dark web and gets used in other ways that certainly make it very difficult. So then you have the impact to the customer, you have the remediation for the client, might be IBM's client, that we have to pick up the pieces, and this is where in the reaction stage, right, it was detected finally, now let's react. And so how do we do damage control? How do we close the holes? How do we make sure there are no similar holes? These things happen quite a bit. Usually they're on a very low scale. You'll find a compromised server, you'll have to deal with that. You'll have a web service that's got vulnerabilities that haven't been corrected, and you'll want to get those corrected before something bad happens. But they certainly do happen. You'll often, if you put up an unprotected system up on the internet that's got common vulnerabilities and somebody's got a rootkit for it, they're going to find it and they're going to exploit it in a matter, and sometimes in a matter of minutes. So just be careful there, as anytime you're putting something up on a public network, you want to take some additional care in what you put out there and what can use it.
Bill, I also noticed in the chat that Isaiah had a question about using notes to send confidential information between two IBM emails. Or should we use a different service for confidential information?
You can send confidential data in the IBM email system. Yep, if it's within the IBM company, you should not worry about that. Certainly Box has become very popular as far as sharing data. That's also suitable for confidential data. AFS, if you mean the Andrew file system, that can also be used. And I will say that if it's Box or AFS, the one thing you do want to make sure, if you're using any kind of distributed storage environment, you want to make sure that if it's confidential data, you have to put limitations in place, whether it's on connections communities, whether, wikis, Box, Slack, AFS, GSA. You need to limit it to only the people that have a business need to look at that confidential information. When we say IBM confidential, it doesn't mean that anyone in IBM can see it. It means that anyone in IBM could potentially be authorized to see it, but you still have a limited set of people that can access that data, and you need to set the ACLs, the access control list, appropriately. Thank you. Thanks for pointing that out, Jim. So this one actually does build. I still left this one in there, right? So everyone's responsible. We need everyone's help in making sure that we can keep ourselves in a really good security posture, because it all comes back as an impact to IBM. The more incidents that happen publicly, even if it could be simple web services or trial service that's put up, if it, you can easily imagine, a public, incident happening and that turning into, bad press, that turns into customers starting to worry about, is IBM really the place that I want my most sensitive data and put my big contracts? So even trial services can have a negative impact on our reputation and future business. So we just want to make sure that that we put the right level of effort into securing and protecting those services and data. Okay, this one also builds a little bit. Okay, so just some thoughts that or some categories, if you will, of the different problems that can occur, the different issues that can cause security problems, right? Incidents create a risk to IBM. People are one of our best defenses, but also at times can be one of our problem children at times. It's very easy to click on a link when you're sent something in a phishing email. It's hard to resist some of them. Some of them are crafted very well. People can sometimes make simple mistakes that can lead to some major issues. And we deal with both insider threats, whether they're inadvertent or malicious. We also deal with external threats. Any of these can threaten the integrity, security, and availability of our environment. The quote at the top is really just a reference to, borrowing a little bit from Winston Churchill's famous phrase, but using it for this purpose, is there is so much computing horsepower that can be thrown at trying to find systems that are vulnerable, and then once you have something that might be vulnerable, using them to crunch away and exploit that, whether it be a brute force password attack, online, offline attack, or whether you're just using something to denial of service, create disruption. People have access to an awful lot of authorized and unauthorized compute resources that can be used, and information about how to exploit things. There's so much out there that people have easy access to. Okay, moving on to some data classifications. So there are a number of, it's a big corporation. There's a lot of different ways that you'll see on websites and wikis and publications and PowerPoints on data. We're trying to, as best we can in our group in Research IT, for the division to try and kind of synergize that, bring some rationality to it. We're always here to explain differences and nuances. If you have them, you'll find that some tools in IBM for registering things like your workstation have a set of data classifications you can check, and then other tools like when you're registering servers in the mixed address database that are on our network, you have a different set of flags. We are trying to be all-encompassing and try and represent all of that, but also make it easier to understand. One of the things that came out from the corporate security folks a couple of years ago was this sensitivity level, which we kind of generally point to as an easier way for people to group things together. And you go, and they're in growing sensitivity, although some of us argue about the order of a couple of the ones near the bottom. But publicly available, there's no limitation on distribution of this. There's no copyrights, that we can freely distribute it. Then you have more internal use, which used to be internal use only, used to be an actual designation inside of IBM for classification. Right now we have just IBM Confidential and Unclassified, technically. And then you go on to confidential. This could be IBM's data or a client's data, customer, partner. Basically, it's something that needs to be limited to a smaller subset of people, those with need to know. And then you move on to the more highly sensitive ones, such as regulated. So I mentioned military. There's something called ITAR, International Traffic Arms Regulations, and anything related to that has significant requirements on security and compliance and where that data can go. For the most part, can't leave the United States if you're dealing with the military in the US. Other countries have something similar for their military intelligence information and technologies that are being created for the military. But it could be regulation of a different sort. It could be regulation for personal data. And there's a growing amount of that. The European Union has had regulations, omnibus they call them, kind of all-encompassing regulations for personal data for quite some time. They just introduced a new one, which is even stronger and broader, which will go into effect in May of 2018. Other countries and regions have been working hard on reinforcing their regulation, their legislation related to personal data. And so the IBM Privacy Office and the IBM Chief Data Office have been hard at work in how IBM will deal with this as an enterprise. And the research, my research team has also been working on how we'll research, how will we deal with this in our research environment, and how will we be compliant with corporate and try and keep things lightweight enough that we're not overburdening, R&D efforts that may not need the same level of rigor, but it really depends on the data, what kind of data is and what you're working with. SPI is sensitive personal information, critical data, or sometimes referred to as crown jewels of a corporation. This is the most sensitive data. It provides major technical advantage to us or business advantage. If we lose it, if it's accessed by unauthorized people, our competitors, maybe we have a 2-year, 3-year lead in the market on something, and we could corner the market, so to speak, on some new solution that's coming out, and a customer gets it, and we've now lost that competitive advantage. So that's a very small subset of the data within IBM, but it is one of the highly sensitive categories. If you're dealing with any of the highly sensitive, many regulated portions, SPI, healthcare data, medical records, personal medical records, critical, crown jewel data of technology, there are additional requirements you have to go through. Again, I don't think you're getting involved with this in the Blue Hack, but if you're dealing with it in other areas, it's something that you definitely want to make sure you work with your teams and you work with security consultants to make sure that things are being handled in the right way.
Bill, I wanted to jump in because there's a question in the Q&A module about, is there any kind of, security level clearance similar to how, the government has top secret or anything like that? I think that's from Corey in there.
There isn't no, there is not a clearance level for IBMers. No. It all comes down to the owner of the data and or the custodian, right? If we're taking data from someone else, and then if it's from a third party, the parameters of that contract and who we can share it with, and then the custodian making the right decisions about who it can be shared with. Or IBM has created the data and we own it, and there's a identified owner, it's likely your project owner, your manager, and then they're making decisions about who can we share this data with. But even highly sensitive data, there are some extra regulations or policies and procedures on what you have to do to track and validate, but it isn't the case where you say go through a background check and you go through a course and it says you're now authorized to access critical data. There's nothing in IBM of that nature.
I was also going to jump in and say, in my 14 years with IBM, I've learned that if it's sensitive or confidential, you will know. Your spider senses will be pretty sharpened, and also that there's a lot of common sense stuff. If there's something that seems like there's a question about its confidentiality, then you talk to someone, you ask, and you use your good judgment.
That's a great point, Jack. Absolutely. Yeah, you will definitely, oftentimes I say kind of put yourself in the shoes of the data, right? That if this was data about me when it comes to personal, would I be okay with this type of, putting in this type of platform or having this type of access? So you're right. You will tend to get a sense of, sometimes it's more obvious, sometimes it's not, but you're right. There's often, but you should also be looking for and thinking about, what is it about this, put some thought into what is it about this data beyond just somebody gave me a big, huge data set of information. I'm going to see what I can do with it. What is it that I have, and what might the risks or issues be with it? Okay. One quick point. We've covered a lot of this, and I know time's running short here. So, we don't want to underclassify data. We don't want to overclassify data. Both can be a problem. The other thing I wanted to point out on here is that proprietary doesn't necessarily mean confidential. Most of what IBM does is proprietary. And you need some level of approval to release it outside of IBM. If it's confidential, there's a subset of that data that is confidential to IBM, and you need not just a manager to say, yes, you can send this data off to somebody that you worked with on the outside. If it's confidential, you have to get a legal agreement signed. Lawyers are involved. You have to say it's a non-disclosure agreement. We're going to share this piece with you. It's a joint project. You're going to share some confidential with us. We'll share with you. Neither of us will disclose it to a third party. So you have proprietary data. You have a subset of that is confidential, and then you have a very small subset of that is highly sensitive, critical, or crown jewel confidential data. The most common example people give is the Coca-Cola formula. If you're Coke, the Coke formula is a key foundation of competitive advantage for your company. They protect that like the crown jewels. So, so that's a very small subset of the data within the company. Okay, I mentioned React before. If anything does happen, there's and we have links here, of course. If anything does happen, there are required reporting that has to be done if it's truly a security incident. It might be something as simple as malware. You got spam. You can just click a button on your email. That's pretty straightforward. But if you've got some really suspicious activity you want to report, if you've got a true security incident that you want to report, you file that. Then they have the cyber team, the CSIRT team of IBM itself. It's going to get involved and go through an investigation and try and find out what happened, what should be done about it. In some cases, lawyers are involved. In some cases, especially if it's somebody who's left IBM, there was an incident before they left, they'll end up communicating after the fact to them legally, right? But we want to do all those things the right way, because you can run into legal problems down the road handle those pieces properly. So if you're ever not sure, ask our security team in research. Go to the web. If it's straightforward, go to the website. You don't need to wait for us. You can go report directly on these links and on these websites. We'll get brought in on the back end as the investigation starts.
That's awesome. I know that we're running a little short on time, so I'm going to try and just bring everybody in so that we can all be reminded that this is about people.
Sure.
Promote everyone into the panel so we
Very
can
good.
say hello to each other. And if anybody has additional questions and wants to ask it in the panel, we're just going to bring everyone in. God will be rejoining. So someone figured out that you can name it whatever you want.
I saw a trucking company in the U.S. driving around that's called God,
Oh, that's right.
guaranteed overnight delivery.
Right.